Doesn't everybody know?
Bless you.
Thank you. Consideration.
September 11th regular meeting of Amherst City Council will come to order. Roll call, please.
Mr. Dembinski?
Here.
Mr. Miller?
Present.
Mr. Winarski?
Here.
Mrs. Vasilk?
Here.
Mr. Van Turen?
Here.
Mr. Janik?
Here.
Mr. Cowger?
Here.
We'll stand for the prayer by Chaplain Silk and remain standing for the pledge of the flag by Sergeant-at-Arms Dembinski.
Will you bow with me, please? Gracious God, bless this meeting tonight. Keep us all within your care. And tonight we pray your protection for those people in Texas, Florida, Puerto Rico, and the other Caribbean islands as they recover from the hurricanes of this past 2 weeks. Give them strength and guidance and protect those who protect them. And now may the words of our mouths and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our redeemer. Amen.
Amen.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Move on to item 4, the consent agenda.
Minutes of the regular council meeting held July 24th, 2017. Minutes of the special council meeting held August 21st, 2017. Minutes of the public hearing held August 21st, 2017. Minutes of the Building and Lands Committee meeting held September 5, 2017. Minutes of the Finance Committee meeting held September 5, 2017. Minutes of the Streets Committee meeting held September 5, 2017. Minutes of the Utilities Committee meeting held September 5, 2017.
Mr. Miller.
Move to accept consent agenda as read, please.
Mr. Dembinski.
Second.
Motion is second on the floor to accept the consent agenda as read. Any comments? Roll call vote, please.
Mr. Dembinski?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Winarski?
Yes.
Mrs. Vasilk?
Yes.
Mr. Van Turen?
Yes.
Mr. Janik?
Yes.
Mr. Cowger?
Yes.
Motion carries. Move on to item 5, acknowledgement of the public pertaining to items on tonight's agenda. Anyone wishing to speak on anything that is on tonight's agenda? If not, we'll move on to item 6, ordinances and resolutions, first reading. Item A,
An ordinance approving the subdividers agreement between the City of Amherst, Ohio and Cambridge Development Third LLC for phases 1, 2, and 3 of the Reserve at Beaver Creek subdivision.
Ms. Silk,
Move to take this to the second reading.
Mr. Miller.
Second, please.
Motion is second on the floor to take item A onto the second reading. Are there any comments? Roll call vote, please.
Mr. Dembinski?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Winarski?
Yes.
Mrs. Vasilk?
Yes.
Mr. Van Turen?
Yes.
Mr. Janik?
Yes.
Mr. Cowger?
Yes.
Motion carries. Item B,
An ordinance reappropriating funds from Electric Department account 620-5001-52501, capital outlay to account 620-5001-52410, line material, and declaring an emergency.
Mr. Dembinski.
Move to suspend council rules so that item 6B may be passed on the first reading.
Mr. Cogger?
Second.
Motion is second on the floor to suspend council rules on item B so may be passed on the first reading. Any comments? Roll call vote, please.
Mr. Dembinski?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Winarski?
Yes.
Mrs. Vasilk?
Yes.
Mr. Van Turen?
Yes.
Mr. Janik?
Yes.
Mr. Cowger?
Yes.
Motion carries. Mr. Cogger?
Move to adopt.
Mr. Janik?
Second.
Motion is second on the floor to adopt. Roll call vote.
Mr. Dembinski?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Winarski?
Yes.
Mrs. Vasilk?
Yes.
Mr. Van Turen?
Yes.
Mr. Janik?
Yes.
Mr. Cowger?
Yes.
Motion carries.
It'll be ordinance 01730.
Item C,
An ordinance authorizing additional funding to perform night work for the Kresge Drive widening project and declaring an emergency.
Mr. Van Kuren.
Move to suspend council rules so that 6C can be passed on this reading.
Mr. Dembinski.
Second.
Motion is second on the floor to suspend council rules on item C so may be passed on our first reading. Any comments? Mr. Miller.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. Mayor, are we set after this is passed on emergency and suspend to start work at
We
night?
start tonight, if this
If
passes.
this passes, we start tonight, and I do appreciate you considering spending a little bit more to make sure that we don't put off our businesses and our customers. So thank you for doing this. I appreciate it.
Thank you for your
It's,
support.
a good call. It's a good call, and I support it, so thank you. With that, I have no further questions, Mr.
Thank you.
President.
Anyone else? Roll call vote, please.
Mr. Dembinski?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Winarski? Mrs. Vasilk?
Yes.
Mr. Van Kuren?
Yes.
Mr. Janik?
Yes.
Mr. Cowger?
Yes.
Motion carries. Mr. Miller?
Move to adopt, please.
Mr. Dembinski?
Second.
Motion is second on the floor to adopt. Roll call vote.
Mr. Dembinski?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Winarski?
Yes.
Mrs. Vasilk?
Yes.
Mr. Van Kuren?
Yes.
Mr. Janik?
Yes.
Mr. Cowger?
Yes.
Motion carries.
It will be ordinance 01731.
Item D,
An ordinance authorizing the city to enter into a contract to read all the city's utility meters and declaring an emergency.
Mr. Dembinski.
Move to suspend council rules so that item 6D may be passed on the first reading.
I'll second.
Motion is second on the floor. Any comments? Mr. Kukuka.
Yeah, reading over this ordinance, I just had one question. Where do you plan on paying this out of? Is it the revenue accounts
Yes.
in enterprise funds? The water, sewer, electric?
And I'm not sure about the sewer yet, but water and electric.
Okay.
And then we'll have to do some shuffling of funds. We still have some money in the meter
Right,
reading
right.
account.
Well, I
So
figured
as soon as
that-
this
I
passes,
figured
we'll
that
do
the-
some
the meter
reappropriating.
readers will go away and put them, we
Right.
have that money, but,
We will still have to reappropriate some monies.
okay, all right. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Roll call vote, please.
Mr. Dembinski?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Winarski?
Yes.
Mrs. Vasilk?
Yes.
Mr. Van Kuren?
Yes.
Mr. Janik?
Yes.
Mr. Cowger?
Yes.
Motion carries. Mr.
Move to adopt.
Mr. Janik.
Second.
Motion is second on the floor to adopt. Roll call vote.
Mr. Dembinski?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Winarski?
Yes.
Mrs. Vasilk?
Yes.
Mr. Van Kuren?
Yes.
Mr. Janik?
Yes.
Mr. Cowger?
Yes.
Motion carries.
It'll be ordinance 01732.
Completes item 6. We'll move on to item 7, ordinances and resolutions, second reading. Item A,
An ordinance adopting a capital asset policy for the city of Amherst.
Mr. Miller.
Move to take 7A to third reading.
Mr. Dembinski.
Second.
Motion is second on the floor to take 7A onto the third reading. Are there any comments? Roll call vote.
Mr. Dembinski?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Winarski?
Yes.
Mrs. Vasilk?
Yes.
Mr. Van Kuren?
Yes.
Mr. Janik?
Yes.
Mr. Cowger?
Yes.
Motion carries. Item B,
An ordinance amending Amherst Codified Ordinance, Chapter 913, Section 913.04.
Mr. Dembinski.
Move to send item 7B on to the third reading.
Mr. Cowger.
Second.
Motion is second on the floor to send item B on to the third reading. Any comments? Roll call vote, please.
Mr. Dembinski?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Winarski?
Yes.
Mrs. Vasilk?
Yes.
Mr. Van Kuren?
Yes.
Mr. Janik?
Yes.
Mr. Cowger?
Yes.
Motion carries. That completes item 7. Move on to item 8, ordinances and resolutions, third reading. We have none. Move on to item 9, miscellaneous acknowledgement of the public. Anyone here wishing to speak on any item? Mr. Miller.
Thank you, Mr. President. As we all know, it's 9/11. It's our 16th anniversary of the attack in New York and DC and the plane that went down in Pennsylvania. With that, I'd like to remember all the safety service, fire, police, others who lost their lives, and even those who were traumatically affected by this. In addition, there were many that left Amherst and Lorraine County to head to New York that day and the days following to assist with the recovery. And we do appreciate their efforts, and we do remember this day, I hope, as a day that shows us how important it is to unify and be American and be there for those who are in need. And as Ms. Wasok had stated earlier, we have a couple hurricanes that are coming through, and we're seeing a lot of ground effort. And I think as a council, we're all at the local level proud of their efforts, whether it be here in the city of Amherst or in the state of Ohio, and especially when other states are calling Ohioans step up, and so do we here. So thank you to all those who serve, and I appreciate it from my heart personally. Thank you, Mr. President. No other comments.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. Anyone else? If not, we'll move on to item 10, agenda requests and committee meeting schedules.
We still have the agenda request.
No.
Mrs. Vassil, could you read that agenda
Yes.
request? It goes to finance.
Yes, this is A 17-45, an ordinance repealing ordinance number 0-01-32 and directing the auditor to discontinue the transfer of funds generated by the implementation of the kilowatt-hour tax from the general fund to the electric fund. That's complete.
And that's the only item we had for this evening, Mr. President.
Thank you. Well, we've seen the others. When do you want to have that meeting, Ms. Rousseau?
Next Monday at 7 o'clock.
Next Monday at
The
7?
18th.
Thank you. It completes item 10. Move on to item 11, reports administration.
Can we go back, could I ask that maybe the food truck item be called for also? And we could discuss that briefly next week?
Whose
I think
committee was that
Mr.
in?
Janik.
Mr. Janik?
Mr.
In your
Janik?
committee, we tabled it a couple months ago. Could we just call for it for next
For
week?
discussion?
Sure. And we'll just discuss it, talk about how we're gonna go about it, maybe, just a real short discussion on how to proceed.
I'd like to call that meeting for right after the finance meeting at 7:15.
Thank you. For discussion only.
Discussion on
Right.
Thank you.
streets.
Mr. Miller?
Just a point of clarification, are we bringing back the same tabled piece of legislation, or are we, what?
I would like
Where
to
we
just
coming-
discuss briefly how to go forward, how everybody might have some suggestions. We just want to talk about how to move forward from here, so I don't really think we want to pass that legislation in its form. But we just want to discuss how to go forward from here and to bring better legislation so that we can get it in front of you soon.
There's no legislation, strictly a discussion.
Well, there is
session.
something in front
Well,
of us.
I
That's pretty
understand that,
lengthy.
but
I would
it's-
like to cut that down.
But I think technically we have to have an ordinance.
Well, I think we'll have the basically with the mayor and submit it before, but
I would just suggest bring back what you tabled and let's talk about going on from here.
Okay.
So, right, thank you, Ms. Miskook, that was my understanding, that we had to have something to work on, and I was wondering what we're working off. We're working off past
Well,
piece,
were you just here because he wasn't?
or do we have a new piece
You
of
might have been.
legislation that's been written? And if so, could I
It's
get a copy
ordinance,
of it?
No.
so it's Joe.
That might have been Mr. Miller's because he was
You
just
were
here
out.
as a substitute.
Oh, yes, that's right. Mr. Miller, you
The
weren't
vice
here.
chair took care of that when I was in my absence.
You were in Europe.
It's ordinance A 1738.
Thank you.
So we're just gonna pull that back up, use that to start, as a starting point? Thank you, Mr. President,
Yeah.
Mr. Mayor, for the clarification. I just wanna make sure I'm.
Strictly a discussion session, though. It's not to send anything to council or anything like that.
And
So,
thank you, Mr. Kukuka, for knowing the correct agenda number.
yes.
I looked it up in my little book here.
And I guess I'll call that, if that's the case.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'll call that for 7:10 on the 18th of September. And that's agenda A 1738.
Okay,
Table. Is that good, Mr. President? Good?
that's fine.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Now
Now we'll
reports.
go to reports to administration.
Thank you very much. Mr. Kukuka?
Thank you. The audit has been released by the state, and that is out on the state website. for the 2016 audit. And council should have received, and in your motion, in the next item, you'll have to motion that you receive both July, let me get this right, July and August.
Yeah.
End report.
Thank you. Mr. Ramsey?
Our July and August reports were distributed as well. End of report.
Mr. McCord?
No report, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Mr. Jeffries?
No report, Mr. Mayor, thank you.
Thank you. I only have a quick couple of things. Last week, if you remember, Mr. Courtney talked about our electric rates and our PPA and how that was figured over a 3-month rolling average and how that might cause some spikes in the rates. So me and Mr. Courtney has talked about that, and we've decided to change that to a 6-month rolling average, and that should stabilize that PPA and cause some of those spikes to be less severe. So that's our first step in changing the way we bill utilities, and I think it'll be a little bit more consistent. So that should start sometime soon. I think you noticed in your mailbox and maybe electronically you received the sidewalk letters that we're sending out. We had almost 900 addresses, so we're probably just over a third done sending those letters out. We're trying to send them out in smaller groups every couple of days so that it's not such an impact on administration. It gives people time to ask questions and we don't have to try to answer 300 of them at once. It gives us a half a dozen questions every other day or so. There's a website, there's an email address, and a telephone number that people can call for questions. So that's going very well. The response has been adequate, and people are calling with questions, and the building department's getting those questions answered pretty timely. So pretty proud of that letter so far. Thank you tonight for passing the extra money for Kresge Drive. We'll get started on that project tonight. There's some message boards on either end of the project that'll keep people apprised of what's going on. So we're really hoping that 99% of that work gets done at night. Some will have to be done during the day, and a lot of thanks goes out to the concrete plant that's going to stay open at night solely for our project. So that's a big help to the citizens and the businesses. Was there a question?
Mr. Cogger.
Yes, I did have someone that received a sidewalk letter contact me. I went out to the address, and I didn't see anything wrong with the sidewalk. I walked the entire development. I noticed 2 different spots, but it was not anywhere near his address. He didn't understand why he got it as well.
And I would hope, I think we sent a memo out, I would hope that if you get any of those responses, you do let our building department, ask people, please call our building department. We could make, I'm not saying we did, we could make a mistake with the address, but some of those specifications, pretty small. We did some during the winter. There actually could have been some heaving or unheaving in that amount of time. So that's why our building department really wants to look at those items. So if the person would call, leave an email, our building department will do exactly what you did and look and review it. If he finds out that there's nothing to be done, we'll change that.
All right.
So thank you for doing that.
2 other things. Approximately how many letters are we sending out in a group?
It's different. We're trying to look at certain areas. So some streets, sometimes we send out just one street. Sometimes we pick so it's anywhere between 30 and 80 probably.
Okay.
And it's every couple of days. We're up to about 350 letters right now.
Okay.
So, and we're kind of depending on how much response, we kind of wait till the calls and emails quit coming in and then we send out another group of letters.
Okay.
So kind of dependent on our response.
And would it be possible for council to get copied on those addresses so we have those too?
Those are available. We can send out an email, electronic version of it. We really hope that the council might let the letter be the first response and let the process, so that we're not getting conflicting answers.
But just so we can keep track of, this person called and said that, they received the letter, we check our list, okay, and their address is on the list, and
right. I would really hope that your first response would be, please call one of those phone numbers, emails, or check the website so we can get them the first response. And if they don't like that response, then I would hope that you would interfere. But please please let us have the first opportunity to talk to those people.
Thank you.
Anything else, Mr. Cogger? Mr. Miller.
Thank you, Mr. President. At one time during this process, we were received on council floor a list of, I believe, a list of these homes.
That was the first 250 or 300.
250, and so those have been all contacted.
They could be part of it. They're not. They might not be the ones. They're part of that list, the final list.
So we have a master list, and is that sitting on the website so people can have more than just the time from the time they receive the letter to the time that the expected?
That will not
fix?
get posted until the more official time. Everybody's going to get a letter. They have a timed response. We want to go out and correct any errors. You know, that people get these letters and they have a chance to ask us. So that's not been posted yet. We don't want all those people. We want to be able to contact people in a timely fashion, so we will contact everybody on an individual basis with these letters.
And right now, then, the time frame for fix, once they receive the letter, is what?
We're in the middle of next year yet. This is still just a voluntary letter that says, here's the 7 pieces of criteria. We've looked at it. You might be in violation of one of these items. If you have any questions, please call us. I think you should have a copy.
Oh, I received that letter, but
So
I'm wondering
real-
when's the timeline for that particular group that's received that letter to have that fix made before the city
It could be
says,
3
"We'll take
years.
care of it."
I mean, it depends on when they get picked for the final assessment. I mean, there'll be groups of people next year that will be put into a bid packet. So we're hoping some of these people fix it on their own. So next year, every one of those addresses will be reevaluated, see who, when they get their building permit. That's why there's a building permit. It's free.
Mhm.
We'll be able to take those people off the list and then resend out a set of letters next year that says you have a certain amount of days to fix it yourself, or the city will do it. And we do not know at this point who those people are going to be. It will be a small portion of those people that are on this first list. It'll only be what the contractors can get done in a year. I mean, the city can only do a certain size project, so this could be a 3 or 4 year project in total.
Now, is the reason for that demand or supply of vendors to do it? Is it what's the reasoning behind not making a large, big bid package?
It's almost too much. Imagine 900 jobs all at once. It's all, I think it's near an impassable feat. It's a lot of money, not only for the city, to try. If nobody does it, the city's going to have to come up with 900 addresses worth of finances to do that. So I don't think there's any one contractor would be able to do that much work in a season's time and bid on it properly. So I'm going to work with contractors to get big enough size packages that we're getting a big enough chunk done, but it's not going to be too difficult to accomplish. I realize that a project this size probably could not get done in 1 year.
And we'll have specs for, say, we get 7 vendors or 6 vendors that are going to
It'll
come
be a
in.
bit. You could have 1 or 10. I mean, we'll put bid
The
specs
city.
out.
The
We'll
city.
put bid specs out, and whoever submits their application will bid on it.
All right, and you want to keep it small enough for one vendor to come in the city, or are you going to have multiple
You're only going to be able to
vendors?
award it to one person. Going to be the lowest and best bid.
Okay.
So you don't want it so big that most vendor. I mean, I don't even think the big. I'll be flat out honest. I don't think the biggest vendor anywhere locally is going to come in here and do 900 pieces of sidewalk and put all their eggs into one basket and get any kind of good pricing at all. So we have to put it in a small enough package to get good prices and to do a good enough job for the people. So that's going to be some brainstorming. That's not just a decision I'm going to be making. I'll be talking to contractors, suppliers, engineers will help me make that decision in safety service structure. And that'll be in front of you when it goes, that list then will again that's when the council will have to get involved and approve those lists when we have to assess people.
Thank you. Any
Okay.
more questions?
Mr. Janik,
My question was answered, thank you.
thank you. Anyone else? I'll entertain a vote. Mr. Miller?
Move to accept reports of administration.
Mr. Cogger?
Second.
Motion is second on the floor to accept reports of administration. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Reports are accepted. Move on to item 12, acknowledgement of the receipt of monthly reports from the treasurer and the auditor for July and August. Mr. Miller?
Move to accept and receive a monthly report from Treasurer and Auditor.
Mr. Dembinski?
Second.
There's motion and second on the floor to accept the acknowledgement of the monthly reports from June and July from the treasurer and the auditor. Roll call vote, please.
Mr. Dembinski?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Winarski?
Yes.
Mrs. Vasilk?
Yes.
Mr. Van Turen?
Yes.
Mr. Janik?
Yes.
Mr. Cowger?
Yes.
Thank you. Mr.
Just make sure it was July and August, not June and
Yes.
July.
Oh, did I say June, July? I thought I said July and August.
I wrote down July and August, so.
Okay. She's got it
I
straightened
got
out.
it.
Yeah. Move on to item 13. Mr. Dembinski.
Move to adjourn.
Mr. Cogger.
Second.
Motion is second on the floor to adjourn. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? We are adjourned at 7:26.
Let's go back to the agenda request.